Ever felt someone getting close, then suddenly pulling away without explanation? One moment they care deeply, the next they act like they don't need you at all. It's confusing, painful, and makes you question your worth. But here's the truth: it's not about your value. It's about their emotional wiring. What looks like distance is often fear in disguise, and what feels like rejection is usually protection. Avoidance in relationships is often misunderstood as a lack of love, lack of care, or emotional coldness. But in reality, for many avoidant individuals, love is not absent, it is simply experienced in a different and often conflicted way. They are capable of feeling deep emotional connection, attachment, and even longing. But when that emotional closeness becomes too intense or too fast, something inside them activates a protective response. Instead of leaning in, they instinctively pull back. This is not because they don't value the person in front of them, but because closeness itself feels overwhelming or unsafe to their nervous system. To understand this, it helps to realize that avoidant attachment is not formed randomly. It is often shaped in early life experiences where emotional needs were not consistently met, or where expressing feelings was discouraged, ignored, or met with discomfort. Over time, the individual learns a survival strategy. Depending on others emotionally may lead to disappointment, rejection, or loss of control. So instead of relying on closeness, they learn to rely on themselves. Independence becomes their safety zone. Emotional self-sufficiency becomes their identity. As they grow older, this pattern does not disappear. It follows them into friendships, relationships, and romantic bonds. When they start to care about someone, they may initially enjoy the connection. They may even feel excited, attentive, and engaged in the beginning stages of closeness, especially when emotional intensity is still manageable. But as soon as the relationship begins to deepen, when expectations rise, vulnerability increases, or emotional dependence becomes more visible, they start to feel an internal shift. What once felt good begins to feel heavy, not because the partner did something wrong, but because intimacy itself starts to trigger discomfort. At this stage, their emotional system often goes into what is called deactivation. This is where they unconsciously suppress feelings, minimize emotional importance, or mentally detach from the relationship. They might suddenly become distant, take longer to reply, seem less expressive, or even question the relationship's value. From the outside, it may look like their feelings have disappeared, but internally, it is more accurate to say that their feelings are being blocked or pushed down to reduce emotional pressure. This is where the biggest misunderstanding happens. The partner on the receiving end often interprets this behavior as proof that there was never real love. But avoidant individuals can care deeply and still pull away at the same time. Their emotional experience is not a straight line, it is a push and pull between connection and self-protection. They want closeness, but they fear losing their sense of control or emotional safety within it. So when we say avoidants are not incapable of love, what we really mean is that their expression of love is interrupted by fear-based defense mechanisms. They may not consistently show affection in ways that are easily recognizable, but that does not mean their emotions are not real. In fact, many avoidant individuals only realize the depth of their feelings after distance has already created space, because in that space, their nervous system feels calmer and less threatened. This is why labeling them as uncaring or emotionally empty misses the point entirely. The truth is more complex. They are often people who feel deeply but have learned to hide that depth from themselves and others as a form of emotional protection. For many people with an avoidant attachment style, emotional closeness does not register in the brain as purely positive or comforting. Instead of feeling warmth, safety, and relaxation when intimacy increases, they can experience a subtle but powerful internal alarm system activating. This is why closeness can trigger fear rather than comfort. It is not that they do not want connection, but that their nervous system has learned to associate emotional dependence or deep intimacy with a loss of control, pressure, or potential emotional risk. This response is often rooted in earlier relational experiences where closeness was inconsistent, overwhelming, or emotionally demanding. If someone grew up in an environment where emotional needs were not reliably met, or where expressing vulnerability led to criticism, rejection, or emotional discomfort, the brain adapts by building protective distance. Over time, independence becomes associated with safety, while emotional closeness becomes associated with uncertainty. So when intimacy appears in adult relationships, the body reacts based on old emotional conditioning rather than present reality. What makes this especially confusing is that avoidant individuals do not always feel fear at the beginning of a relationship. In the early stages, when things are light, exciting, and emotionally low pressure, closeness can feel enjoyable. There is connection without too much demand, attention without too much expectation. But as the relationship progresses in emotional depth, increases when conversations become more vulnerable, when expectations for consistency rise, or when the bond starts to feel more serious, the internal system begins to shift. What changes is not the partner's behavior alone, but the level of perceived emotional demand. At that point, the nervous system may interpret closeness as something that could lead to emotional entrapment or loss of autonomy. Even small things, like frequent messaging, emotional dependency, or discussions about the future, can create internal pressure. This pressure is not always logical or conscious. The avoidant person may not be able to clearly explain why they suddenly feel the need to withdraw. They simply feel off, overwhelmed, or suffocated, even if the relationship is healthy on the surface. To regain emotional balance, they unconsciously create distance. This can appear as reduced communication, emotional withdrawal, distraction, or shifting focus toward work, hobbies, or solitude. From their perspective, this distance restores a sense of control and calm. From the partner's perspective, however, it often feels like rejection or sudden emotional disappearance. This mismatch in perception creates confusion and emotional pain for both sides. It is important to understand that this fear is not necessarily about the partner themselves. In most cases, it is not that the avoidant individual believes the partner is unsafe or unworthy. Rather, intimacy itself is what feels intense. Emotional closeness becomes a trigger for vulnerability, and vulnerability feels risky. The fear is less about the person and more about what emotional merging represents: dependency, exposure, and the possibility of being hurt or overwhelmed. Because of this, avoidant individuals often experience an internal conflict. One part of them desires connection, affection, and companionship, while another part pushes them to maintain distance in order to feel secure. This creates a push-pull dynamic that can be very confusing in relationships. They may move closer when they feel safe and pull away when the emotional intensity increases again. Understanding this pattern does not mean excusing hurtful behavior, but it does provide clarity. What looks like emotional inconsistency is often a nervous system reacting to perceived emotional threat. Closeness, in their internal experience, is not simply love, it is also something that must be carefully managed too. Avoid feeling overwhelmed or emotionally exposed. When someone with an avoidant attachment style begins to feel emotionally overwhelmed, they may become withdrawn, anxious, or depressed. One of the most common coping strategies they use is emotional deactivation. This does not mean they stop having feelings altogether. Instead, it means they unconsciously shut down, suppress, or disconnect from what they are feeling in order to reduce emotional intensity and regain a sense of control. On the surface, this can look like sudden coldness, detachment, or indifference, but internally, it is more like an emotional switching off mechanism designed to create distance from discomfort. This process is usually not a conscious decision. An avoidant person is rarely thinking, "I will now turn off my emotions." It happens automatically when emotional closeness, vulnerability, or relational pressure crosses a certain threshold. The nervous system perceives too much intimacy as a form of stress, and in response, the mind steps in to reduce emotional activation. One of the easiest ways to do that is to minimize feelings, rationalize the situation, or redirect attention away from emotional dependence. For example, instead of sitting with feelings of attachment or longing, they might start focusing on the flaws in the relationship or the partner. Small issues that previously felt insignificant can suddenly feel very important. They may begin thinking, "Maybe this is not the right person," or "I don't really feel that connected," even if just days before they felt deeply engaged. This shift is not necessarily because their feelings changed in a stable way, but because their mind is trying to create emotional distance to reduce internal pressure. Another common form of deactivation is emotional suppression. Rather than expressing what they feel, they push it down. If they feel hurt, they may not show it. If they feel attachment, they may avoid acknowledging it even to themselves. This suppression gives them a temporary sense of stability, but it also creates emotional confusion. Over time, they may struggle to clearly identify what they are feeling because they have trained themselves to disconnect from emotional awareness. Distraction is also a major part of this strategy. When emotional closeness becomes too intense, avoidant individuals often shift their attention toward work, hobbies, social media, or anything that allows them to regain a sense of independence. This is not always avoidance in a negative sense, it is a coping mechanism that helps regulate emotional overload. By focusing on tasks or external activities, they reduce the emotional intensity that comes from relational closeness. What makes emotional deactivation particularly confusing for partners is that it can appear sudden and inconsistent. One moment, the avoidant individual may be affectionate, engaged, and emotionally available. The next moment, they seem distant, uninterested, or detached. This shift can feel like rejection or emotional withdrawal, but internally it is more about self-regulation than relationship evaluation. They are not always consciously deciding to pull away from the partner. They are trying to pull away from the intensity of their own internal emotional experience. It is also important to understand that deactivation is often followed by emotional clarity only after distance is created. When the pressure decreases, their emotional system settles, and feelings that were previously suppressed may resurface. This is why some avoidant individuals appear more emotional or reflective after space in a relationship. In the absence of pressure, they can reconnect with emotions they temporarily shut down. At its core, emotional deactivation is a protective mechanism. It allows the avoidant person to manage feelings that feel too intense, too vulnerable, or too consuming. While it can create distance and misunderstanding in relationships, its original purpose is self-protection, not emotional harm. What often looks like emotional withdrawal, inconsistency, or sudden distance in avoidant individuals is frequently misunderstood as a simple loss of interest. But in most cases, the underlying driver is not rejection of the partner, it is protection of the self. Their distance functions as a defense mechanism designed to prevent emotional overwhelm, loss of autonomy, or vulnerability that feels too exposed. To understand this, it is important to see distance not as a statement about the relationship, but as a response to internal emotional pressure. For someone with an avoidant attachment pattern, closeness can gradually build emotional intensity. At first, connection may feel exciting, safe, or even comforting. But as the bond deepens and expectations become more emotionally charged, the internal system begins to interpret that closeness differently. Emotional dependence, frequent intimacy, or the expectation of consistent vulnerability can create an internal sense of being too close for comfort. When that threshold is reached, the mind and body seek relief. The most familiar way to achieve that relief is to step back. This stepping back is not usually planned or logically decided. It happens in subtle ways. The person may take longer to respond to messages, reduce emotional expression, become more focused on personal activities, or seem less engaged in conversations that once felt meaningful. From the outside, these changes can feel sudden, but internally, they are gradual attempts to restore emotional equilibrium. The goal is not to hurt the partner, but to reduce the internal sensation of emotional overload. What makes this dynamic particularly painful in relationships is that distance is often interpreted through the lens of attachment insecurity. The partner may assume that something went wrong, that they are being rejected, or that the avoidant person has stopped caring. But in reality, care and distance can coexist. An avoidant individual can still feel attachment while simultaneously needing space from that attachment. This creates a paradox. The more they feel connected, the more they may need distance to regulate that connection. In many cases, distance becomes a form of emotional breathing room. It allows the nervous system to calm down and re-establish a sense of independence. Independence is not just a preference for avoidant individuals, it is often tied to their emotional safety. When they feel they are losing too much autonomy within a relationship, stepping back becomes a way to regain a sense of control over their internal world. This is why their withdrawal often increases when emotional expectations increase. However, this protective distance can unintentionally create a cycle. The partner, feeling the shift, may try to close the gap by seeking reassurance, expressing concern, or increasing emotional engagement. While this reaction is natural, it can unintentionally intensify the avoidant person's sense of pressure. As the perceived emotional demand increases, the need for distance also increases, reinforcing the cycle of push and pull. It is also important to recognize that this defense mechanism is not about a lack of emotional capacity. Avoidant individuals are not incapable of deep connection, rather. They often struggle with tolerating sustained emotional intensity. Their system is built around managing closeness in smaller, controlled doses. When emotional closeness exceeds what they can comfortably regulate, distance becomes their way of restoring balance. Over time, this pattern can create confusion for both partners. One experiences emotional pursuit, while the other experiences emotional retreat. Yet beneath both responses is a shared human need: safety. The avoidant person seeks safety through distance, while the partner seeks safety through closeness. The difference lies in what each nervous system has learned to associate with comfort. So, what appears on the surface is emotional. Withdrawal is often, in its deeper layer, a self-protective strategy. It is not always about leaving the relationship emotionally, but about temporarily stepping away from the intensity of it in order to feel grounded again. When dealing with avoidant attachment patterns in relationships, one of the most misunderstood dynamics is the idea that the more someone pursues closeness, the more secure the connection will become. In reality, for avoidant individuals, increased emotional pressure often has the opposite effect. Instead of creating intimacy, it can activate their need to withdraw. This is why chasing, whether emotional, physical, or conversational, tends to push them further away, rather than bringing them closer. To understand this, it is important to recognize how avoidant individuals experience emotional intensity. When they begin to feel that someone is moving toward them with strong emotional need, they may start to feel a sense of discomfort or unease, constant reassurance seeking, or persistent attempts to deepen the bond. Their internal system may interpret this as pressure rather than love. Even if the intention behind the pursuit is genuine care, the experience on their side can feel like emotional demand or expectation. This perceived demand activates discomfort, because closeness starts to feel less like a choice and more like an obligation. When emotional pressure builds, the avoidant response is not to engage more deeply, but to create space. This space gives them time to regulate their internal state and reduce the feeling of being emotionally overwhelmed. So when a partner increases chasing behaviors such as frequent messaging, repeated questioning about feelings can lead to a decrease in the partner's self-esteem and self-worth, or attempts to force clarity, the avoidant individual may unconsciously increase their distance. It becomes a protective reflex rather than a calculated decision. This dynamic creates a cycle that can be very difficult to break. One person feels uncertainty and tries to resolve it by moving closer, while the other feels that closeness as intensity and responds by moving away. Each action reinforces the other's reaction. The more one chases, the more the avoidant person retreats. The more they retreat, the more the partner feels anxious and tries to pursue. Over time, this pattern can create emotional exhaustion on both sides. It is also important to understand that chasing often removes something essential for avoidant individuals: the sense of emotional autonomy. Autonomy is not just important to them, it is central to how they maintain internal stability. When they feel that their space, pace, or emotional boundaries are being overridden by persistent pursuit, they may feel overwhelmed, anxious, or drained. They may experience a loss of control over their emotional environment. This loss of control can trigger further withdrawal as a way to restore balance. Another key aspect is that chasing can unintentionally shift the emotional dynamic from connection to pressure. Instead of experiencing the relationship as a safe space, the avoidant individual may begin to associate it with emotional intensity that they feel unable to escape. Even positive intentions such as expressing love repeatedly or seeking reassurance can become overwhelming if they are perceived as constant or demanding. In these moments, the nervous system prioritizes relief over connection, and distance becomes the quickest form of relief. What makes this especially complex is that avoidant individuals do not always consciously recognize why they are pulling away. They may not be thinking, "I am being chased, so I will withdraw." Instead, they simply feel the need for space without fully analyzing the cause. This is why their behavior can seem inconsistent or unpredictable to their partners. The internal experience is often emotional overload, not strategic rejection. At the same time, it is important to clarify that avoiding chasing does not mean emotional abandonment or emotional indifference from the partner's side. It simply highlights that connection in these dynamics is best built through emotional safety rather than pressure. When avoidant individuals feel that they are free to engage at their own pace, they are more likely to engage in activities that are enjoyable and fulfilling. Without being pursued or pressured, they are more likely to gradually re-engage emotionally. Ultimately, the core issue is not pursuit itself, but intensity without regulation. Healthy connection requires space where both closeness and distance can exist without fear. When that balance is disrupted by chasing behaviors, avoidant individuals tend to protect themselves by stepping back, not because they do not care, but because they do not care, but because they need emotional breathing room to feel safe enough to care without overwhelm. Real emotional connection does not come from intensity alone, it comes from safety. For individuals with avoidant attachment patterns, this principle becomes even more important because their ability to stay engaged in closeness is directly linked to how emotionally safe they feel in the relationship. Unlike the common belief that love alone is enough to create stability, avoidant psychology shows that love without safety often leads to withdrawal, not bonding. Emotional safety, in this context, does not mean a relationship without conflict or challenges. It means a relationship where vulnerability does not feel like danger. For avoidant individuals, vulnerability is often the most difficult emotional state to sit with. When they feel exposed, judged, pressured, or emotionally overwhelmed, their instinct is to protect themselves by creating distance. However, when vulnerability is met with calmness, patience, and consistency, their nervous system begins to recalibrate over time. One of the most important aspects of emotional safety is the absence of pressure. Pressure can take many forms. It can be direct, like demanding answers about feelings or commitment, or indirect, like repeated reassurance seeking or emotional urgency. Even well-intentioned emotional intensity can feel overwhelming if it is constant. When pressure is removed, avoidant individuals are no longer forced into defensive states. Instead of reacting to emotional demand, they are given space to naturally process their own feelings. Consistency is another major factor in creating emotional safety. Avoidant individuals often struggle with trusting emotional stability because at their core, they are used to inconsistency in emotional experiences. When a partner remains steady, emotionally available but not intrusive, caring but not overwhelming, it gradually builds a sense of reliability. This consistency does not immediately change behavior, but it slowly reshapes internal expectations. Over time, the nervous system begins to associate the relationship with stability rather than unpredictability. Equally important is emotional non-judgment. Avoidant individuals often carry an internal fear of being criticized for their emotional distance or misunderstood for their need for space. When a partner reacts with judgment, frustration, or emotional escalation, it reinforces their belief that closeness is unsafe. On the other hand, when their need for space is met with understanding rather than punishment, it reduces internal resistance. This does not mean accepting unhealthy behavior, but rather responding in a way that does not escalate emotional threat. Safety also comes from allowing autonomy within connection. Avoidant individuals often feel most secure when they know they are not losing themselves in a relationship. If they feel they still have personal space, identity, and freedom to regulate their emotional pace, they are more likely to stay engaged. Ironically, the more freedom they feel within a relationship, the more capacity they develop for closeness. When autonomy is respected, connection feels like a choice rather than an obligation. However, it is important to understand that emotional safety does not create instant transformation. Avoidant patterns are deeply learned responses that develop over time, often as protective adaptations. Because of this, even in safe relationships, avoidant individuals may still withdraw at times. The difference is that withdrawal becomes less extreme, less fear-driven, and more temporary. Instead of long-term emotional shutdown, there is a gradual return to connection once internal balance is restored. There is also a subtle but powerful shift that happens when emotional safety is present consistently. Avoidant individuals begin to experience closeness without the same level of internal threat. Moments of intimacy become easier to tolerate because they are not followed by pressure or emotional demand. Over time, this allows for more genuine emotional presence. They start to engage not because they feel forced, but because they feel capable of staying without losing themselves. At its core, real connection with an avoidant individual is not built by chasing, convincing, or increasing emotional intensity. It is built through creating a relational environment where their nervous system does not feel the need to escape. When safety is established, connection becomes something they can approach gradually, without fear overriding emotion. And in that space, genuine intimacy has the possibility to grow not through pressure, but through trust.